Welcome to the For Everyday Leaders podcast. Brandon Faust and Alex Holt here with you today. Alex, why don't you tell us what this podcast is all about?
Yeah, this podcast is all about equipping and helping people in the everyday spaces and moments of life. And today we have with us Stephanie Fernhaber. Stephanie is the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Butler University. She has authored 20 journal articles. She's the co-author of the book Design for Good with Brenda Freije. Design for Good is a guide for faith communities to co-create impactful solutions in the world. She's developed a myriad of social entrepreneurship opportunities in initiatives in Indianapolis through her communityINNOVATE project. Among them, the 2018 Indy Youth Empowerment Challenge and the 2017 Indy Healthy Food Access Challenge. She's married and has 3 wonderful daughters.
And before we get to our conversation with Stephanie, this episode of the For Everyday Leaders podcast is sponsored by Ascend Roofing. The team at Ascend are a perfect sponsor for this podcast as they embody everyday leadership in their business. They're locally owned and operated, and Ascend Roofing has more than a decade of focused residential roofing experience. They service the entire greater Indianapolis area, and I've personally had Ascend Roofing come out to my house, and they went above and beyond my expectations. So whether it's to respond to severe weather or it's just time for a new roof, visit their website, ascendroofingllc.com. That's ASCEND roofingllc.com. Stephanie, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
And it was probably in 2018 that we met at the local church that we were both attending. And I had the chance to get to know your husband really well before I got to know you. And then over time, got introduced to you, would say hello, casual, say hi to your daughters. But then really around the time that I was getting ready to launch full-time into the work that we're doing with Wayfinders and Switchback, got to know you even better. And you even asked me, I don't know why, but you asked me to even preview your Design for Good book that you and Brenda wrote together. And it just gave me, wow, like the way that your mind works and your passion for design thinking and helping others all kind of came together in that book. And I just remember enjoying those conversations a lot. I also remember enjoying in this building that we're in right now, having some conversations where you're just like, just go for it, man. Like just encouraging me. And I'm really grateful for that. And we've had since then, over the last 4 years or so, the opportunity to partner with you with some of your classes that you lead at Butler University, with some of our workshops and frameworks, and had the opportunity to do some like a small internship thing with one of your classes. And then you've been involved with our new initiative, the Wayfinders Impact Studio, and served on our advisory committee and have been guiding us in a lot of ways. So I've just enjoyed so much and have benefited so much just from what you're passionate about and how your ideas around co-creating solutions and helping make our world a lot better, and using some really good frameworks and processes that you've curated, that you've developed to help others. So thank you for all of that. But I think, you were one of the people, and I asked you a few months ago and you said, catch me in the summertime. And I was like, all right. I feel like your story is unique, and the way in which you're going about serving and helping others and finding ways to just be impactful to others is something that people need to hear. So tell us kind of, what was life like for you growing up? Where did you grow up? And just kind of get us started there before we start talking about career path a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on here. It's always fun to kind of step back and reflect on our journey. So I grew up in northern rural Wisconsin. My family moved there when I was just 3 years old to be part of a small church on the Menominee Indian Reservation. And I always have to clarify, my parents are not pastors. They just moved there to be part of it. So my dad's actually in construction, and my mom does a lot of things and stayed home with us kids, but is really gifted in a number of areas. So we moved there when I was 3, and Gresham is a small town, about 500 people. And we lived a mile outside of town, so we were in the country.
Very rural.
Yeah. And it was just a small community. Everyone knew who you were. I graduated with about a little over 15 students in my high school class, most of which I knew from kindergarten. So that was life growing up. And I would also add that I come from a large family. So there are 7 of us kids, and I'm number 5.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so.
Wow. And I remember looking up your hometown one time because of this property that's now up there that you guys are involved with. And I was like, wow, that is really far away from here. And it is way up in Wisconsin. Yeah. It is way up in Wisconsin. So from living in, rural northern Wisconsin, how did you end up on this path of innovation and entrepreneurship and being a professor? Kind of what were those next steps and some of those interests towards the end of high school and into those kind of college-ish years? Yeah, well, we didn't travel much with that large of a family, and except to see our relatives, right, which were in Wisconsin in various communities. We had one trip, but that's another story. So I think, but I always had a curiosity for getting to know others, and maybe that comes from my parents and some of the things that they've done. But I always had this kind of little dream tucked in the back of my head. Somebody had asked me in high school, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, well, I want to teach, but at the college level. And I didn't know what teaching at the college level entailed. I just knew that I had a lot of class clowns for classmates, and I thought it would be easier at the college level. So that was my only thought. So I kind of tucked that little idea in the back of my mind, and years later, when the timing was right, I thought, gosh, I'd really like to see if I could make that a reality. And when I did, I didn't know what it entails, right? So I talked to other people that were professors, and I learned more about what this job actually is, and that it's actually, a lot of it is research, right? And trying to create new knowledge as well as teaching. And I loved that. That was really something that I wanted to do. So fast forward, here I am. And that's how we got down to Indiana, I should add. And that I went to the PhD program at IU in Bloomington.
Cool. Nice.
So talk a little bit about what was undergrad. What did that look like? Did you study education, or what was that pathway for you like?
In undergrad, I studied business and Spanish. And I would say the business part was, I always had interest in business. I was good at like math and accounting type classes. And my dad had his own construction business, so I was probably exposed to it in that realm. And so that was, I don't know, I just always kind of shifted towards that area. That was always my main focus. And the Spanish, again, was just my curiosity. I studied abroad and left the country for the first time on a major trip when I was like a junior in college and went to Costa Rica. And that was really, I guess, that really shifted my my mind just to, the world is so big, right? And there's so many different people that, it was fun. So that was kind of what happened there. And
that's interesting. I want to jump back to something you said that really struck me, that idea that you were exposed to your dad's business. And that's really kind of what drove some of the like desire to get into this like field of entrepreneurship innovation. In your work, have you seen a correlation between people's exposure to family business, family experience, the things that their parents are involved in, and a desire for them to jump into like an entrepreneurship type mindset?
Yes and no. I think that we do see people that grow up. Obviously, if you grow up and you're exposed to kind of that entrepreneurial, kind of more creative thinking, you're going to naturally hone those skills, right? And then you're going to realize that you're good at that, perhaps, and that's what you want to do. So we do see a lot of that, but we also see students that haven't thought that way at all, but they have this amazing kind of way of thinking that if we can shift them on how they can utilize it. So we kind of see both.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, a great question.
Yeah, because I think that is such an interesting thing of like people who maybe observe small business or even larger business and that entrepreneurial vibe. And then there's some people who are like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that because it was maybe a positive or negative. Maybe it was a negative experience for them. But then also people who, and as we work, especially with a lot of young people downtown on like the east side and stuff, what you see is sometimes there are kids who are like, yeah, my dad is an entrepreneur, my mom is an entrepreneur, and then other kids who are like, I want to make a difference in my community, so I'm going to learn, and who can I be around who's doing this stuff? And I think it's a reminder that you just never know the opportunities of who's watching, who's looking, who you could be a mentor close up or from afar, whether college level or
Yeah.
high school students or whatever. So how then, okay, so now you're, on the timeline, you're kind of doing this PhD program at IU. Did you guys like move to Bloomington
Yes.
kind of area?
Mm-hmm.
And then what came after that? What was the next step? Was that like a direct step into, teaching at the college level as you were finishing up? Or
Yeah,
what did that look
well,
like?
I think life is never as smooth or as planned out as we expect. So there was lots of hiccups, I would say, along the way. Even, I had this dream to get into a PhD program, and I went out and visited all the programs, and I realized I liked it, but I also realized that it was really hard to get into programs. They only accept 2 or 3 people a year because it's part of this assistantship, right, or program. And so I applied to all the programs I wanted to. I knew I wanted to go to IU, and I didn't get into any. And I share that because that's what real life is, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of and I remember kind of being a little discouraged and saying, but I really want to do this. But I had alternate backups like, oh, well, I'll go into this career path. And that would have been fine. But I know my husband encouraged me, said, well, maybe we can look at this differently. Why don't you just reach out and ask, instead of going through the assistantship route, we can get a loan and we can kind of go in it through this route. And so I did, right? So I reached out to them, and I was able, and it actually all ended up working out perfectly, right? So I got in, but I like to share that story sometimes because I think that everyone thinks that it's always easy, right? Each step of the way, and it isn't. And sometimes you have to persevere and think creatively about what's a different way if I really want to do this. It might not have been the way that I wanted. So even after I got my PhD, I thought it was going to go one route, and I ended up taking a few years off and going in a different direction. And but if you stick with it, I think just kind of just take a different perspective. It kind of works its way out, maybe not the way you planned.
Well, and I think even like you said, like as a teenager, you had this thought that got tucked in your brain, and my wife Lisa, her story, like she had this idea, she wanted to be a nurse practitioner, kind of scale down to part-time, be home with kids, but also have a meaningful career that she loved. She tucked that away, and it's like, boom, here we are. And I realized that, most of us probably have more agency than we realize. Obviously there are some very real challenges in resiliency things and economics that come with a lot of this stuff too. Yeah. But I think most of us have more agency than we probably give credit for. And I think that linear path that I think we often think that everyone who looks like they've got it figured out, that it was just all up and to the right the whole time. And I've very rarely met anybody who, if you really get under the surface, that it's all just been up and to the right and on this clear crystal path. And I know for me, like the journey has had one of our guests said it was kind of like, career Candyland, right? Like you're just like the twists and the turns and, oh, this felt good and this was awesome. And then why did this happen? And
you get moved back 4 spaces.
Yes. And this setback and all those kind of things. So that's good.
But I'm in a beautiful place right now, and that I really love my job, right? And I love where I'm at in the community. And so yeah.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
So talk about where you're at right now, the work that you're getting to do, kind of how you landed at Butler in this role, and then some of the other community initiatives that you're diving into and working on.
Yeah. Well, so, I've been at Butler about 12 or 13 years now, and in their entrepreneurship innovation area. And it's been fun because I kind of came in right at the beginning of developing out our department in programming. And so we have a great team now that I get to work with. So I teach, social entrepreneurship is what we've talked about a lot. That's probably one of my favorite classes that I get to teach, that we work in the community with it as well. So it's kind of my way to kind of play a little bit and to see what's out there. So I teach a variety of classes: entrepreneurial mindset, first year business experience, those sorts of things. So I teach, and I also like to, when I can, be involved in the community. And how I think what's been on my mind, especially the last 5 or 7 years, is how do we really take what skill set we have and make a difference? Not just I love it that I can be around students, right, and make an impact there. But what else can we do within the community? So I think where I am now is experimenting in different ways, right? And time is a limit. And, I have 3 teens right now, so it kind of shifts things. But yeah, when I was on, we mentioned Community Innovate, and when I was on I took a sabbatical about 5 or 6 years ago at Butler, and that's when I got to, I guess, kind of play and apply some of what my hunches of what I'm in the classroom is, could we take some of these innovation processes and design thinking approach, human-centered design, can we take that out into the community? Yeah. And is there a way that we can kind of bring people together to help collectively, address social issues that we're facing? So, so I don't know. So I've kind of, stuck my toes in different areas.
That's incredible.
And I would say it's probably changed who I am more than I perhaps have impacted the other way, right? It's really changed.
Well, and I love to hear you talk about that you're still experimenting. Like you're still trying new things. You're still looking at different ways of how can we approach problems. I think often for leaders, we get stuck in a career path, in a rut that we're like, man, I'm just here. This is what I was built to do. This is what I was made to do. These are the skills I have. And we think that I'm going to spend the next 30 years doing whatever it is. And so it's just super encouraging to hear you say that you're still experimenting and you're still trying new things and exploring and discovering.
Yeah, I've had a lot of wonderful mentors in my life, but I still remember Mary Avery was my professor who actually I took an entrepreneurship class from when I was in my undergrad, and we've stayed good friends. And I remember talking with her and her husband, and at the time I think they were going to turn 50 or something. And what they told me is that we don't know what we're doing in our life, right? We're still figuring it out, right? At the age of 50, they're still figuring it out. Yeah. And they're reinventing themselves again and again. And I think that's always stuck in my mind that, you know what, we don't have to, we can continuously be evolving.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I talk about a lot is if we can just get people in the right, or help them see themselves in the right quadrant of where they want to play and make a difference. I think we're so obsessed with like this title, this GPS coordinate, and then just stay there. And the truth is you're probably not just going to ever stay there. And you are going to, whether it's the changes and trends in the workplace or whatever, what does it mean to refine skill sets? What does it mean to know, hey, here's my like sweet spot of skills that I like to use and can put them into whether it's a community solution or something in my workplace or something in my home even, right? Like these are my preferred things to be doing. And I think really making, what does that whole life impact thing look like? And where does my career fit? And where does my purpose fit? And how do those all mash together? And I think what's fun is, when you think about entrepreneurship and innovation, it kind of demands innovation, right? And creativity and expressing that. But I think the ways in which I remember in some of our conversations, I'm like reading these things that you had mentioned, and I'm like, that project seemed amazing. Like that is so cool. But like you said, sometimes when we go and have the courage to try something new, it forms us more than us feeling like we're making all the impact. But what are some of those things? Like, I mean, obviously, like design thinking principles and innovation and co-creating solutions with others, something that matters to you. You co-authored a book on that, right? But what are some things as people might be intimidated? They're like, well, I'm not an entrepreneur, or I'm not a creative person in their thoughts. They don't think that necessarily. But what are some principles for real life that you can kind of, maybe even just for your life, that you've extracted around some things of innovation or design thinking that we can use in like everyday life?
Yeah, well, I would start with the preface is that I do not define entrepreneurship as business ownership. So I think a lot of people associate those two, but I like to think about it more as a mindset, right? A perspective on how you, and entrepreneurship really is discovering opportunities, right? Evaluating them and implementing them. And I like to think that I'm entrepreneurial in my approach to teaching. You're entrepreneurial in this approach to how you're, pivoting on this blog and leaning into it. And if we think about it that way, I think that we all have the potential to innovate and be entrepreneur, whatever it is that we do.
Yeah,
That's really good.
So that's my, like, I think my big thing. And if we step back, then we all have the ability to innovate.
Yeah.
And I could tell you lots of stories about how we were innovative as parents early on, right? And we had to think creatively about how we're juggling these careers and how we're doing things.
Yeah.
So what are some principles that I think we can all apply? So first of all, share, design thinking or human-centered design is really an approach to innovation where you put the human or the individuals you're designing for at the center. And that sounds really intuitive, right? If you're going to innovate, don't you want to do that?
Yeah.
But our instinct is to think that we know what's best and just jump right to coming up with ideas and implementing them. But sometimes when we do so, we miss the mark completely. So what I love about design thinking is it starts out not by coming up with solutions, but really saying we have to better understand the problem or the opportunity here. And in order to do that, you have to talk to people. And a lot of times we realize we have to go in a completely different direction. And I love design thinking because it makes it easy. It sounds really hard to come up with a solution to an issue, but if you start here, it's gonna naturally, it's easily kind of unveil itself. So when I think about how to apply this to us personally, I love that kind of that gathering empathy phase when you're trying to understand people. And I think we can, just that skill of empathy and storytelling and trying to get to know people, being relational, I think we can apply that aspect of design thinking to our everyday lives. I think even in the past few weeks, there's been a lot more divisiveness, right, as new legislation is rolled out. And I just think if we can go and talk with people that are different from us, we can ask them to share their stories, to understand their perspective instead of trying to share ours, that we would gain so much more insight, and we'll see that it's a lot more complex and messy than we think. And versus standing aback. And so I think number one, that's probably the design thinking principle that I try to rely on in whatever I do, right?
Yeah, that's so good, because I think having been in the book and also being somewhat familiar, you send me some articles here and there that stretch my brain all the time. But I think that that empathy part, I think a lot of times in my head, sometimes I would always be like, well, empathy, or you just feeling bad for somebody. And it's like, no. Seeking to truly understand, seeking to really put yourself in that person's shoes and slowing down. And, and in this whole polarizing, at least in my lifetime, it feels like very polarizing time the last few years. And we hide behind statements or behind a party or a stance or this or that. And then we're afraid because I don't want to make anybody mad or this or that. But like empathy is just that curiosity and trying to understand and trying to love by, seeking to listen, but instead of just being speaking all the time, which but like in everyday life, people you work with, people in your own home, people in your neighborhood, people in your faith community, people in your town, like how beautiful in this age of personalization, personalization of a curated playlist that Spotify knows kind of my trends and what I want, or recommends that I buy this item from Instagram. And it's like, oh, that is a cool shirt, But like that personalization cannot replace like the personal contact and the personal understanding and the empathy and all those kinds of things. And I feel like God's been kind of working on my spirit in those things a lot the last few years. It's really, really good. What's like an everyday, and I think you kind of broke this down a little bit, but just maybe something else from your story. What's like an everyday leadership principle that you've carried with you on the journey, on the trek of, the candy land of career and timing and kids and, being married and navigating a significant career? Like, what's a principle that you've just kind of carried with you in that?
Well, I think another principle, and it relates a little bit back to design thinking, there's a word that I love, which is co-create. And when you co-create, you're doing it with other people, right? Hopefully the people you're designing is something for. It takes more time, and that's why we want to skip it. And we want to be, and I'm an efficient person, right? I have 3 kids. I have a lot to get done. I can get very transactional and inefficient. And there's a need to kind of slow down. To go slower is better. You're going to have better outcomes. You're going to have more buy-in. And so this notion of co-creation, it's when you come up with a new idea, right? You kind of want to hide because you're a little bit vulnerable. Like, this isn't really that good, right? So you want to wait till it looks perfect and then unveil it. But when you do that, nobody wants to give you feedback. So they're afraid that they're going to hurt your feelings, right? And it might be totally missing the mark. So this idea of co-creation as incorporating more people early on when it's really rough stages and keeping them involved. Again, it's more work and it takes more time, but you're going to have better outcomes and more buy-in. So that's something that I think I try to practice in the workplace and in the community and in the family. It doesn't always. We there's hiccups, but that's something that I keep coming back to, just to take the time, be relational, and go slower.
That's so good.
Well, I think that comes to this principle of like we versus just me. And moves things from more of that relational, transformational instead of just transactional. And gosh, like that's countercultural in a lot of ways. You know, and I think about some of the things that you've been helping us with. And there are times where I'm like, well, this doesn't feel perfect enough or beautiful enough. And you said something in passing to me, I don't know when it was, in the last month or two. I don't know if it was an email or when I saw you and you're like, you know what I like about you guys is you guys just kind of go for it and try things and learn. And I'm like, there are so many times that I feel like, I mean, even this podcast, we were talking to you about this idea in 2015 and we shared some of that story with our listeners before. Like, we sat on it because it was like, oh, it wasn't the right time. It didn't feel like it was perfect. And even now it's not perfect, right? But like, if there's something, a stone that gets put in your shoe for a reason, pay attention to it. Because it might mean that you need to do something and it's going to benefit other people. And when you get to do it with other people, you get to learn so much. You get some feedback, you know, when you really, truly slow to a pace where you can kind of co-create and learn and get feedback. It's so good, Stephanie. It's so good. Well,
you know, that kind of comes back to somebody told me that. And that's why. So back when I was in 2017, 18, I had this idea of doing this communityINNOVATE, this platform. I was introduced to some folks at the Kepra Institute here in town. And I would say that they're the individuals that have perhaps transformed me or impacted me the most, who I am here in the last, here in Indianapolis. And I just remember them telling me to go for it. And I also remember them slowing down and asking me, why are you doing this? And trying to get to know me. So those kind of exhibiting that, it's kind of like what I try now, because I experienced it, that I try to kind of pass along that. Just go for it.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Awesome. So as we start to wrap up our conversation today, what is a book, a podcast, some resource that you have just been loving lately that you can share with our listeners?
Well, I love to read a lot. And I was thinking about this. I think one book that really has piqued my interest lately is Atlas of the Heart by Brenda Freije. Just kind of giving me some of the language and trying to understand myself better and others.
So good. Love anything by Brenda Freije.
And they talk about empathy.
She and I would just say I think that's the second or third time. Not that book, but a Brene Brown resource. And so, on that, all of us are often, I would just encourage you, if you want to grow in your empathy, self-discovery, learning more about who you are, how those things got there are so important, because it does, not just for ourselves, but it helps us to really see others. So that's great. We'll link to that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do people find you, find some of the things, find your work, find your books? Where are some places that people can maybe find what you're up to and what you've got going on?
Well, LinkedIn's probably the easiest way to kind of find me. Our book is on Amazon, or you can go to designforagood.world. Or reach out to me via email.
Awesome.
That would be great.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to link to the book and your contact info in the show notes.
Yeah, and we want to say thank you to Stephanie for joining us today. And we want to say thank you to all of you for tuning in of this episode of the For Everyday Leaders podcast by Wayfinders. And we hope it helps you lead in the everyday spaces and moments of life.
Yeah, we would love to have you continue to join us on the journey of this podcast. You can subscribe to the For Everyday Leaders podcast by Wayfinders on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and YouTube, as well as Google Podcasts. We'd also love for you to leave a rating and share the podcast. That helps other listeners and viewers find this great leadership content. Stephanie, thanks so much for being here, being in studio with us today. This was an incredible conversation. We're super grateful for you and the work that you're doing.
Absolutely happy to be here. Thanks for having me.